Hi, welcome. Where to go? Yeah, hi. Welcome to the Education Policy Seminar today. As Shannon said, I'm Eli Talbot. I'm a second-year doctoral student in the Research Statistics and Evaluation program. This talk is part of the Education PolicyWorks seminar series sponsored by the Bankcard Fund for Political Economy and co-sponsored by the Economics Department. Each semester, EdPolicyWorks hosts a number of talks from external and sometimes internal speakers on a host of educational policy and research-related topics. These talks are free and open to the public. Our next speaker will be Dr. John Holbein on December 4th. For more information on EdPolicyWorks or the next seminar, please visit our website. Today, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Fran Murphy. Fran Murphy currently serves as the Manpower Analyst and Branch Chief at the U.S. Army Human Resources Command in Fort Knox, Kentucky. He is a 2000 graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and earned his PhD in Education Policy Studies and MA in Economics at the University of Virginia. Fran's research investigates challenges and opportunities in manning the all-volunteer force, as well as human capital investment and outcomes for military service members and their families. His work has been published at the Journal of Labor Economics and Journal of Human Capital. Fran previously served as a rotating military faculty member at West Point and with the 1st Infantry Division on multiple combat deployments to Iraq. He also completed an MBA at the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. Dr. Murphy will be talking for approximately 1 hour and will leave 15 minutes for discussion and questions. Please note that any additional or personalized questions after 1:15 p.m. can be addressed via email, as other meetings will begin at that time. Thank you for attending the Education Policy Seminar today.
All right. Well, thanks, Eli. Everybody can hear me okay, I assume? Excellent.
Sure can.
Well, that was a really nice and generous introduction. Thank you so much for that, and also for the opportunity to present and get some feedback on this new work that my co-authors and I are really excited about. I have to say it's great to be back at UVA, albeit virtually. I grew up here and received just some incredible training and mentorship from folks like Jim, Ben, Sarah, and many others. And, to this day, I still cherish both the training and the collegiality from the program. So it's great to be back. I do want to acknowledge my co-authors. Dalton Ruh is a recent STAR grad of the undergrad program in economics at UVA. He's now at the DC Fed. And then Sarah Turner is one who doesn't really need an introduction, just kind of a titan in our field and a wonderful person, both to continue to learn from and to be able to call now a co-author. So again, this work is called Work Boots to Combat Boots, Mass Layoffs and Military Enlistment. Before I forget, I should mention that key caveat, that this analysis and these views are those of Dalton, Sarah, and me, and in no way, shape, or form do they represent academic affiliations or the DoD, Department of the Army, etc. So let's get to work. So just one research question here. And what we're really trying to do is quantify the extent to which the military option might be a channel of adjustment for young workers who face really negative local labor market shocks. That's our research question. So the next slide provides a little bit of background on what we think is a really important topic. Plenty of nice contributions in this space already. So we are far from the first to tackle this very important issue. So as the first bullet says, econ and policymakers are absolutely concerned with how place-based declines in employment affect young adults, young workers. And we've seen that the impacts, particularly of uneven exposure to Chinese imports trade imbalances. These impacts are heterogeneous, so they have uneven impacts across workers, but they are particularly hard on young adult males who are less educated. So we've seen that these types of trade exposure have both reduced employment, but also increased unwanted outcomes like idleness and lack of labor force participation. So what are these young workers going to do? Recent research has shown that migration is a limited response for a couple of reasons, and that there is that decrease in labor force participation as well. So inevitably, we turn to and consider sheltering institutions. Again, the question is, what are these young people to do? So there's been some prominent research recently in education as a sheltering institution. And unsurprisingly, Sarah has made some really nice ongoing contributions in this space. So what we've seen is that these negative local labor market shocks have increased persistence in secondary school. They've also increased enrollment in community college. And then we should point out that these effects can go the other way. So for instance, when there are increases in local labor demand, like for fracking or housing bubbles, we actually see an effect go the other way in education. So we see lowered collegiate attainment and also an increase in high school dropouts. So we can't dispute that education is an important sheltering institution when young adults face these types of shocks. But the next natural question, or a next natural question, is what about the military? Could it be that enlistment all of a sudden makes a lot more sense for these individuals facing these downward trending labor markets? And that's the empirical topic of what we want to discuss today. So briefly, we can consider the military enlistment decision as a cost-benefit analysis, just like a lot of other tough decisions are. So when we think about how an individual might benefit from enlistment, we have to think about a steady paycheck and job stability, right? So individuals sign up for typically 3 or 4 year contract terms. And frankly, it's pretty hard to be fired from the military. I myself am coming up on 19 years and I'm still employed. So a nice perk there is the job stability. Keep your nose clean, work hard, contribute to the team, and very likely at the end of the 3 or 4 years, you'll have the opportunity, you'll have the option to re-enlist. Additionally, the military offers nice pension and retirement benefits for those who continue to stay. And then we can't forget about the education opportunities, most notably in the very generous post 9/11 GI Bill that other ed policy researchers at UVA, Andrew Barr, Ben, myself, have looked at as well. Medical benefits matter too, but then there are the job hazards. Signing up for the Army is inherently signing up for the risk of armed conflict. And frankly, location matters too. You're almost certainly going to be leaving home, and not all military locations where we garrison troops are incredibly desirable. So this is certainly a cost-benefit analysis, but our take in the current context is that the idea of pay and job stability that don't vary regionally could be particularly beneficial to young adults facing a declining local labor market. So what we want to do is investigate empirically whether we see an uptick in enlistment when these individuals see and endure these declines in the local labor market. So now I want to go over some of the data elements that we've brought together to look at this tough problem. And we actually start with a really cool program that the Bureau of Labor Statistics ran for about a decade and a half. So through this mass layoff statistics program, or the MLS, BLS analysts would track initial unemployment insurance claims of 50 or more within a 5-week period that are filed against the same establishment or organization. And then they would follow up both with individuals and the establishment to indeed confirm that a mass layoff event had occurred. So they did this for years and across establishments. And what they built was this really nice data set of these layoffs based on the UI claims. And these layoff events are quantified by the number of workers laid off, obviously, and they are tied to a zip code. So what we're able to do is to aggregate these up by zip code to what we think is a reasonable measure of a local labor market, something called a commuting zone, or a CZ. And we're able to do it for multiple years based on the availability of data. And what we essentially create is something that you can think of as an exposure type variable that individuals face in their local labor market. So the histogram on the right side of the slide shows that there's some really nice variation in this, if you will, exposure variable. So for 6 total years, 716 commuting zones, we've got about 4,200 observations across space and time. We've got a mean layoff share of close to about 1%. That's the central tendency of the histogram. But we've got some nice variation both left and right. Let me back up a second. I skipped a step. In order to calculate this exposure or layoff share, we took the counts by time and geography of the layoffs and divided those by the working age population there. So when we say a 1% exposure, that's saying that the working age population in that CZ, that commuting zone, that year, about 1% of the working age population faced one of these mass layoff events as chronicled and tabulated by the BLS. So again, just a really cool source of publicly available data that is a big part of how we're able to tell this fairly granular story at a geographic level of layoffs and enlistments. Very quickly, in slide 6, I want to talk to you a little bit more about what a commuting zone is. And I should probably apologize to each of you for showing another map with blue and red colors on it. I think you've probably gotten tired of viewing those in the last week or so. But nonetheless, this is the layout across the continental United States of the 716 commuting zones. And you'll see Charlottesville's commuting zone in red, but also blown up with the shading in the Google map. So again, we think that this is a reasonable measure of a local labor market based on where we think people would commute to and from for work. So in the case of Charlottesville, of course, you've got Charlottesville in the middle. You've got surrounding communities like Ivy, and we actually go as far north as Culpeper. And we go west a little bit and approach Waynesboro, but don't technically include it. But when we start to think about what's too far, obviously DC, and Richmond are outside of the commuting zone. So again, this slide tells us, it depicts what the Charlottesville commuting zone is. So we've got a little bit more data that we've collected and aggregated at this unit of observation that is the commuting zone times year. I already talked about the layoffs, which are a big part of the story here. We're also able to collect enlistments into the active component Army. And crucially, the administrative data to which we have access have the home of record zip code for the enlistee. So we can very easily aggregate those up to the CZ times year. And what we see is that on average, for our period of study, we see about 87 enlistments per commuting zone times year. Moving to the bottom of the slide quickly to look at the characteristics of our enlistees. These data show what you might have anticipated anyway. Our enlistees are heavily male. They're young, and typically they come with a high school education as their top level of attainment. We do see a little bit of some college and college degree holders, but those are rare. And then AFQT is essentially an aptitude test that all applicants have to take in order to go through the enlistment process. And we see that about 3/4 of our enlistees are in the interquartile range of the AFQT. So those are our enlistees. The other piece of data that I'm happy to report that we could track down is actual data on recruiter assignment and employment in the Army. This cards on the table, this was a bit of a blind ask to my teammates at U.S. Army Recruiting Command. You can always ask for data, right? Sometimes the answer is no, sometimes it's yes. But what they shared with us was average strength of Army recruiters at the recruiting station level, the RSID number. So recruiting, as we wrote in the paper, is inherently a decentralized activity. We don't put recruiters at big bases and battalions and brigades. They've got to be out there with the populace because they do the very challenging business of selling the Army one-on-one to prospective recruits, to parents, to counselors, to influencers, etc. That said, we were able to get these data and then aggregate recruiter strength by year, by commuting zone. And the reason this matters is because I think it helps us get at a potential mechanism of any responsiveness that we find of enlistments to local labor market declines. Because it could be the case, and actually there are some recent papers in the political science literature that assert that the US government, the Army, is very responsibly assigning recruiters to geographies where the local labor market is declining. So if this were the case, and thankfully we can quantify it with our granular data, if this were the case, we might see the uptick in enlistments being a response to this recruiter intensity, this recruiter action, rather than what we actually think it to be, which is a supply side response of young people out of work who are seeking employment. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Again, very happy to have tracked down all of these data elements. So slide 8 shows our equations for estimation. This is pretty simple, ordinary least squares with fixed effects. And we run two different estimations here. So in the first, our outcome variable is the actual enlistments. either in levels or in the log. So in the levels, these are just counts, and we're able to measure a linear responsiveness to our explanatory variable of interest, that being the measure of local labor demand at that location during that year. We also do the log of this outcome variable so that we can estimate a semi-elasticity, so that type of a response to the local labor market. Secondarily, we put a share variable on the left-hand side, and we estimate whether or not these local labor market shares impact the share of enlistments from different demographic background or education aptitude groups. So this is kind of the intensive margin of enlistment, right? So are these labor market changes impacting who actually enlists? As I mentioned, the LD variable is our key explanatory variable. This is, for the most part, the mass layoff data that I already described, but we run a supplementary specification where we use a measure for projected labor demand using the Bartik shift share instrument that is pretty heavily used in places in the labor econ literature. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. And then again, we've got fixed effects for the year and also the commuting zone. So for instance, we want to soak up attitudes towards military service that are time invariant to a specific location. We want to soak up trends in military compensation. The year fixed effects do that. So we're using that type of fixed effect estimator there. And then finally, the epsilon is the unobserved term that we assume to be conditionally independent of our measures of labor demand. I should point out that a recent paper using the layoff data, this is Ann Stevens and co-authors, did some pretty convincing work on the exogeneity of the mass layoffs. They did an event study that found neither long-term labor market declines nor local trends in migration prior to the labor events, right? So this is supporting evidence that this right-hand side variable really does represent a random shock to these workers, these young adults who now have to adapt. Okay.
Fran, do you mind if I jump in with a question?
Yeah, please, Ben, go ahead.
So do you mind backing up a slide? Yeah. Remind me the years that are going to be included in your.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So we've got 6 years for the layoff estimation, kind of our primary results, 2006 to 2011. So we don't have granular home of record on the recruits before 06. And then the layoff data, the program ended in 13, but I think they started packing up in 12 because 2011 is the last year that those data are complete.
Got it. And so over that time period, and correct me if I'm wrong here, you've got obviously active deployments in combat zones, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I assume, and you can correct me here, there could very well be variation across commuting zone by year in the share of service members that are in hazard, experiencing casualties. And then you also have in the middle of your years, obviously the introduction of GI Bill, which comes with this interesting locale specific funding. And so I'm curious, one, I'm wondering if you explored commuting zone by year fixed effects, or or if that, I'm trying to think whether that feels like you'd still have the identifying variation of differences in labor demand within those. But I guess I'm curious if there's other differences at the commuting zone by year level within your period of analysis that could explain enlistment decisions beyond the local labor market. Again, exposure to either community members or just local news about hazard deployments and or casualties. And then I'm trying to think whether there's a way that the kind of locale specific funding of GI Bill could differentially affect people's interest. If they know I'm in a place where there's a good housing allowance, and so on the margin, I'm going to be more likely to enlist.
Yeah, no, those are great points, Ben. There are actually a couple of papers that we cite that seize upon this variation in casualties by time and location, and they see an effect in enlistments, going down when there are more casualties at the local level. It would be pretty cool to get some of those data as another regressor and see if our results are robust to that. The GI Bill one is tougher. If we just ignore your point about the different incentives and housing allowance at locations, so just the GI Bill introduction itself, the post 9/11, of course, the year fixed effects would cover that. As far as we didn't do anything with year times CZ fixed effects. I don't think we have the degrees of freedom to do that, unfortunately. So that's a good one. That's something we'd have to wrestle with a bit.
Got it. Thanks, Fran.
Yeah, thank you. Great questions. Okay, so slide 9, want to present the first series of results. So this is the enlistment response to mass layoffs using the primary explanatory variable. So the left pane or panel of the slide shows the semi-elastic specification. So the outcome variable is the natural log of the recruits, and then everything that we regress on is in linear form. So what we see is that a 1% increase in layoffs at that locale during that year increases enlistment in that CZ by 2.8%. So on an average, keep in mind, we had a lot of variation here, but for your average commuting zone, that 2.8% is against a baseline of, I think, 87 enlistments. So we're talking about 2.5 more enlistments in that CZ based on the 1% uptick in layoffs. And so that's what we depict in column 1. In other specifications, we test for lagged response to the layoffs, and we don't really see evidence of that. And we also put in a linear commuting zone trend to see if there are trends, patterns, something else going on in that commuting zone that could tamper our effect. And we see that our primary result is robust. It's stable to the inclusion of that trend. The right side pane is our linear specification. But this is focused in on the young population, the young adult population that we're really concerned about. So here, we're estimating the impact of a 1% increase in the layoffs on the recruits within just the population of 18 to 24-year-old young adults. And what we see is that a 1% increase in those layoffs leads to, after we do some coefficient conversions, we find that that 1% increase leads to 0.18 more enlistments per 1,000 young adults. So 0.18. Our baseline, what we would expect out of those 1,000 young adults, independent of the layoffs, is about 7.5 Army recruits out of 1,000. So that 0.18 is about 2.5% greater than that baseline. So there's some similarity between the two modes of estimation that we present on this slide. A technical point is that the natural log specification, so what we do on the left panel, we can't include CZ year observations where there's a 0 value for outcome. So we lose a little bit of sample size there. But again, it's not really that different from what we do in the linear specification for the 18 to 24-year-old recruits. So again, key takeaway here is that 1% increase in layoffs increases enlistment in the CZ by close to 3%. And when we quantify that for the 18 to 24-year-old young adults, it's about 0.18 more enlistments per 1,000 young adults. Okay, so this next slide shows some additional results on this shares question. So the intensive margin, if you will, of who actually enlists within the CZ when there are these labor market declines. So for the most part, we don't really see huge impacts here. Certainly nothing in the broad demographic groups, nothing really to speak of for the AFQT quartiles. Remember that measure of aptitude. There is, however, something of an interesting effect for the some college population. So the way we interpret that coefficient there, the 0.407, is that we divide by 100. So we get about 0.4 of a percentage point increase in the some college share for a 1% increase in mass layoffs. And that's against a mean share for the some college types of about 4.67 percentage points. So we've got about a 9% increase in the share of enlistments coming from the some college population. So this is an interesting subpopulation in our study because these individuals aren't fresh out of high school. They aren't looking for that first job at 18 or 19 years old. Rather, they are a little bit older, to the extent that young adults can be a little bit older. They've already sheltered to some extent in education, but didn't complete a bachelor's degree in college. But now as they sit in their young 20s, seeing these deteriorating labor conditions, they are drawn to a different type of sheltering institution, that being military enlistment. So again, I think this is a nice supplemental finding for a subpopulation of interest.
Fran, oh, go ahead, Jim.
So Fran, my understanding is that much of the variation that you're leveraging here comes from the Great Recession. Is that right?
Some does. I mean, and we saw that in the summary stats for years '08 and '09, where there is quite a high value for the layoffs. But there are some years before and after where we have that similar variation.
Yeah, and again, I will defer to you on this, but my understanding is that while the recession itself was more limited, the definition that MBER uses for the defining of the recession was more limited in time, that the effects in many states carried well past '09.
Yeah.
That there were, if you look at a map, I'm doing a little bit of work on this, not on this issue, but on using the Great Recession. And in some regions of the country, it continued well into 2011 and even beyond. So my question is more, I think it would be helpful to understand more about where you're getting the variation that's identifying these estimates, and how much of that might be coming from the Great Recession. But then, to the point that you're making on this slide, I guess the question is, who was unemployed as a result of the Great Recession? Does that in these CZs line up with, the effects that you're showing for these people with some college, for example? And I'm just trying to get a tighter link in the mechanisms by which you're identifying effects back to perhaps a source of much of the variation from which you're identifying those effects.
Yeah, no, those are great points. First, on the variation, I am happy to report that when we look at our 4,200 observations or so at the CZ times year for that, I think I called it an exposure, so that layoff share, when we regress that on just the year fixed effects and the commuting zone fixed effects, we have substantial variation remaining. So that I think that helps us a little bit, that it's more than just the years per se and the commuting zones. In terms of the linkage, we see a little bit more with the other indicator of local labor demand with the Bartik shift share instrument. We're able to use a longer panel, but also focus more tightly on the 18 to 24-year-old population. So that might assuage some of your concerns in terms of making the linkage. And it turns out that that's what we're doing next.
Fran, on the some college findings, this is based on data. Service member self-report at entry on education level, or based on a clearinghouse match?
No, this is service member self-report. These are the data on recruits. Yeah.
And you don't have anything from about their debt, student debt at the point of application, do you?
No, I sure don't.
So just something, I don't know whether Sarah would think this is viable or worth exploring, to the extent that you could match to NSLDS, the National Student Loan Database. It would be particularly interesting to see whether this effect is concentrated among people with debt, and depending on their sources of debt, whether one motivation for pursuing military services to take advantage of the SCRA protections. And I don't know if there's a way you could do that, and it would be an angst, right? That for people who have assumed debt to pursue some other vocational path and are faced with declining local labor market opportunities, is another dimension of that makes the military attractive, is the ability to cap debt payments, because SCRA was in force at this point, I believe, right?
Yeah, and beyond just SCRA,
So
depending upon job specialty and the Army's need at the time, the Army will offer significant enlistment bonuses. In addition to that steady recurring paycheck, those would be other means. for that former student to at least chip away at the debt. So unfortunately, we don't see that in the data that we have, but that would be an interesting merge to try to run down, because it certainly seems plausible. Thanks, Ben.
Hey, Fran, really quickly. I'm Walter. I'm a PhD
Walter.
student. Good
Yeah.
to see you. Quickly on the last slide. So I may have missed this because I may have been thinking about my question, but
Yeah.
we see this uptick for folks with some college. We also see a huge downtick in folks with just a high school degree and no college. And I'm wondering what the hypothesis there, like, are they getting crowded out? Is it that feels kind of curious to me? It's like, okay, fewer jobs available in the area, folks with high school degrees are enlisting less than they were prior, if I'm reading that right.
Yeah. So a couple thoughts. I mean, first, mechanically, this has to be a zero-sum game, because
Right.
we're talking about the intensive margin. This is shares within those folks who do enlist. But I think the other thing that we might see from the high school grad population is a fleeing, if you will, to education, as another sort of sheltering institution, and higher education in particular. Because when you look at those folks, as opposed to the some college, you're looking at individuals who potentially haven't even tried higher ed yet, but the opportunity cost of the local labor market has changed. So they are tilted a bit towards higher ed as opposed to enlistment. So that could be something going on there.
Got it. Thanks very much.
Yeah, good question. Thank you. Okay. Slide 11. This is pretty cool, right? Remember how I talked about getting the recruiter data and trying to at least rule out something that could be a mechanism driving these enlistments, right? So it could be the case that the Army is tracking these layoffs, or was tracking at least as closely as the BLS was, and then it was strategically deploying recruiters at the local level to go after folks laid off by Plant X or Firm Y. I'm not saying that that's how we typically move our people. In fact, the opposite is kind of true, but we wanted to be able to test this just in case. So what we show here in columns 4 and 8 is a bit of an expansion of the OLS regressions that we had run and discussed before, where we include that by CZ, by year recruiting strength as an additional regressor. And perhaps unsurprisingly, in each case, our coefficient of interest hardly moves. So we still see what we characterize as a supply side response to the layoffs, wherein these young adults are pursuing out of area employment opportunities like the military, in the wake of these labor market declines. So again, very happy that we were able to track down these data and include this robustness check to get a little closer on what we think the mechanism is. Okay, so really nice work so far. I think, again, I give a lot of credit to my co-authors. But what we've done to this part doesn't really scale our estimates within the labor force, since the mass layoff data aren't granular for age. So we can't focus on what share of young adults was laid off in these big events at the CZ times year for just young adults. We can look at enlistments with that granularity, but unfortunately we can't look at the layoffs themselves. So what we did was to look for a secondary measure of local labor demand. And it turns out to be one that allows us to expand our zone of consideration from a year standpoint, because we can now go beyond 2011 when the BLS mass layoff data started showing incompleteness. So in particular, what we do is we turn to the American Community Survey, the ACS 1% sample from 2006 to 2016. And this allows us to calculate not working rates by age range. So this will be a secondary left-hand side variable that I'll show you in the regressions in a second. So what is this thing now, absent the layoffs, that we're using as our demand shifter? Well, what this is a measure of projected labor demand using a Bartik shift share instrument. So what we're doing is we are summing across industries. That's I in the notation, the product of these two things. First, it's that industry's employment share at the location. But then second, it is the change in employment for that industry, but outside of the location that we're focusing on. So when you look at the subscripts in the notation there, that US not S is every other geographic location except S. So when we take this product and sum it across industries, we've got this measure of projected labor demand, and we mechanically avoid any kind of simultaneity between that location and what we're trying to measure. So this is again a nice exposure type variable with that mechanical step to exclude the given location. And I want to be clear in what we do with this thing. Even though a lot of the Bartik papers that you see are two-stage least squares, instrumental variables type estimation, where the instrument or where the Bartik measure is an instrument for actual employment. Here, we're actually estimating the reduced form. So we're taking this Bartik shift share and just putting it directly into the right-hand side and using a classic least squares regression. So the results for that regression show on slide 13. First, we put the change in the enlistment rate for 18 to 24-year-olds on the left-hand side. And what we see is that a 10% increase in predicted growth in local employment decreases enlistment by 2.6 potential enlistees per 1,000 young adults. That's what we show in column 3. Right next to it in column 5, we also want to take the not working rate for that same age group, put that on the left-hand side, and then estimate with the shift share. What we see there is that a 10% predicted increase in local employment decreases the not working rate for those 18 to 24 by about 73 young adults per 1,000 young adults. When we think about enlistment being a response to a declining local labor market, it might be easier to think about the negative of what I just reported. But in any case, what we want to seize upon is the coefficient ratio, because that allows us to size how much the enlistment option potentially offsets the job loss that these young adults see in a labor market decline. And so you see right there that the ratio of the coefficients is roughly about a 30th. And so based on that, we estimate that the enlistment response, just the Army alone, offsets about 3.5% of the job loss that those young adults experience following a labor market decline. Now, keep in mind, this is the Army alone. The Army is but one of the service components, right? So if we conservatively scale this thing to think about some of the lesser services, right? The Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, if we conservatively multiply our estimate, our point estimate, by 1.5, we see that this offset factor approaches 5%. So with that, I think we've got some pretty convincing evidence that the military option is a significant structural stabilizer when these local labor markets decline. So from there, we'll go to the summary of findings. Again, we see that significant local response to the local labor demand shocks. And again, with the recruiter data, we attribute this more to the supply side of young folks seeking employment rather than any kind of increased recruiter intensity at the local level. Second, we don't see a lot of action at that intensive margin of who actually enlists, but we did see the moderate effect for some college types, and we think that there's a reasonable story that could explain that. Although going deeper on the potential college debt would be a nice expansion here. And then finally, there's the point about the structural stabilizer. Using the ACS data, the 1% samples, and the Bartik shift share technique, we believe that we're able to size this response within that young adult population that we care about. And that's where the 3.5% point estimate comes from. And we're really happy to be able to report that finding. So with that, team, that completes the material that I wanted to cover today. I'd certainly be happy to turn it back over to you for more questions or comments.
Thanks so much, Fran. We really appreciated you doing a deep dive with us. So as Fran mentioned, if anyone has questions, feel free. You can kind of just jump in and ask them or raise hand, and you need a little bit of think time. I'm sure none of us would mind that as well.
Fran, just going back to the GI Bill idea, as a first pass, did you look at, did you have a chance to look at whether there's any difference in estimates if you run this pre and post, what was it, August 2008? I mean, there's obviously other things going on, but just whether they're potential effects of local labor market conditions before and after GI Bill introduction.
So that would be easy to do. We actually didn't do that, but that's a check we could make. But like you said, wherever you draw that boundary, there's just so much else. No, in terms of
just
Army op tempo and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Just as a first indicator of whether it's worth maybe exploring further.
Yeah. No, that's certainly something we could do, though.
So Fran, you may have mentioned this in your discussion of that you see this as a supply side effect, not a demand side effect. So is it the case that demand for new recruits has been fairly constant? And if that's the case, then who's getting recruited is changing as a result of this, right? That you're getting more of these mass layoff people, which means you're getting less of some other groups, right? Which sort of you got at a little bit in that slide of, and that Walter made the comment on in terms of high school grads.
Yeah, so recruiting targets do change over time. for instance, the Army's end strength peaked during the Afghanistan surge, while we still had significant troop levels in both theaters, Iraq and Afghanistan. And that was actually towards the tail end of the years for which we have data. But our focus was more on this employment capability and the extent to which a given local recruiting brigade or battalion might be surging recruiter focus here rather than there because of a layoff event. And the data that they gave us would have allowed us to pick up something like that. And we just don't see evidence that they're shifting that that focus area for the recruiters. And frankly, when we think about how mid-career Army folks are assigned, we move people a lot, but it's every 2 or 3 years. We aren't moving people quarterly or at the semester or something like that. I'm not sure if I really answered your question there.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you talk about the employment effects, that how this buffers the downturns as a result of these mass layoffs, and I think it was a 3.5% number that you used. But I guess I'm trying to make sense of this as an overall increase in the employment that the Army has, and that's where this is coming from, or are we just shifting where we're getting these recruits from to these mass layoff places from other places? So there's not the net effect on overall employment in the economy. It's just where we're finding these recruits.
Yeah, so I think I understand a little bit better now. I think one of the challenges for the 6 years that we did have data, the Army was in a growth period. I mean, for sure, increasing, in strength in some cases by 10,000 or more per year, and it was to meet these wartime demands in 2 different theaters. So I think what our research shows, of course, Army employment is increasing, but we're more focused on where these recruits are coming from, like you said, at the local level. So is it the case that the military employment proposition becomes more desirable when a local labor market declines? And I think we have shown that it absolutely does. That steady paycheck, having a job, but also the reasonable expectation of being able to keep that job is certainly desirable.
Fran, I had a quick question about, you talk about that 3.5% as an employment offset for the young adult, and then that some college number there, and that's self-reported. So I'm wondering if that some college is included in the young adult, that 18 to 24 range is what I'm assuming, or if there's a labor market employment offset for individuals that are not considered that young adult age range.
Yeah, so I don't know for sure. Because with that particular comparison, we're cutting across data sources. But the 3.5% is certainly inclusive of everybody who's 18 to 24. Okay. I'd have to go back and do some tabs to see the age profile of some college enlistees, how many of them are older than 24. But I suspect that most of them are in that range. Yeah. Okay. Good question.
Other comments or questions for Fran? Okay, Fran, thanks very much. This was wonderful. It was great to see you again after a little while. And this is a wonderful paper. Thanks for doing such a great job at presenting it.
Thanks, Fran.
Hey, well, thanks everybody. It was an honor to be back virtually and to get some really nice feedback and some tough questions on the work. Thanks everybody for your engagement this afternoon, and please do continue to stay well. And I look forward to seeing you again in person, someday. We'll get there.
That would be nice.
Yeah.
And Fran, you are now a Zoom expert.
Well, I had a lot of good coaching. Thank you.